passed on to the other side. So we were just planning his 90th birthday a few months from now, and he had a an incredible life and died with people around him that loved him, with his family, feels the love from all of us. And just personally, I got to go take my little 10-month-old baby Eli up to hang out with him and Peggy before he passed away. So we're grateful for him. And it's one of those things where 90 years old, you live well, you die with feeling loved. So it's a celebration, but it's hard to let go. So, as you post Tony quotes and videos and talk about what he's meant for so many of you, make sure you tag us. And um, we're also still going to have a 90th birthday. I just said Tony's going to join us remotely, though, from the other side with the angels and the saints. So, but thank you for being here. And there's some cool stuff happening. There's always a lot going on at RLC, but we have book club every month, and I'm not going to jump ahead because Susan's going to introduce Khristi, but it's really exciting tonight. Well, I am going to jump ahead. This is our book for tonight, y'all. Just check it out. And if we always say you're welcome to come, even if you didn't do your homework. So we'll get back to that in a second. And I'm so glad you're here. I want to say that on the first of each month, we do morning prayer. And this month is going to be really special because we're going to have uh, our friends from the West Bank joining us. So it's a special monthly morning prayer as we kick off Advent with a number of friends, actually many of them joining from Bethlehem, very appropriate for Christmas season. And so don't miss it this month. It's at 9 o'clock on the first of each month. And Jonathan and I lead that from Common Prayer each month. So not just this month, but every month. And let me tell you this, I'm not great at my screen sharing, but I'm doing my best here, y'all. Check it out. I'm going to show you one other thing. Here is you're one of the first to get to see this. This is, look at this, an Advent devotional that we've been working on, centering Palestinian voices, many of them writing from Bethlehem. And for every day in the season of Advent leading up to Christmas, we will have a devotional, we'll have a reflection, a prayer, ways that you can take action. We're obviously remembering our friends in Gaza and the West Bank. So there will be some people you recognize and others that'll probably be new. There's a few international allies, but it's been dozens of groups working together to create this. So it will be released in just a few days. You're getting to see it before anybody else. So it's been an amazing holy project. So got that going. And this is my last thing I'll tell you is that next month our book will be Today, the Best Day of My Life by Kevin Burns and Kevin Riggs. And let me just tell you real quick, these two brothers are in Tennessee, but Kevin Burns is living on death row. He is fighting for his life. He was convicted and sentenced to die. And I've known him for over 10 years, been visiting with him, praying with him. Incidentally, you can read the book, but I believe that he's innocent and wrongfully convicted. But at any rate, I was there when he was ordained by our other friend, Kevin Riggs. So he was ordained on death row, and to our knowledge, is the only ordained pastor on death row pastoring a congregation of folks that are also incarcerated. So it's an amazing story. It's a story of the gospel, really, but it's also a story of someone who's currently living on death row. So it's not every day that we even have a book by someone that's at Unit 2 in Tennessee's death row. And so it's amazing, amazing story, God's grace and love. So that's next month. But tonight is Womanish Theology, and I am excited to have Susan Wood she's on staff with Red Letter Christians, but so by the way, does all of our blog and content on the web. So she's incredible. And rather than just one of us do these book clubs, we believe in community. So we love like each of us saying, I want to do this one. I'm going to get Khristi on it. I want to talk to her. So Susan gets to like facilitate the conversation. I'm going to step back and just enjoy it. But Khristi, I'm so grateful for your book and your voice, and we are honored to have you as a part of the Red Letter Christians Book Club.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks for having me.
Susan, all yours.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start off telling a little bit about Khristi. Just read your bio if that's okay, real quick, if people haven't already read it. Khristi Lauren Adams, MD of Princeton Theological Seminary, is a speaker, writer, youth advocate, and ordained Baptist minister. She is the award-winning author of Parable of the Brown Girl, named the best young adult book by the African American Literary Awards in the New York Black Librarians Caucus, as well as Unbossed, How Black Girls Are Leading the Way, and its middle grade version, Black Girls Unbossed, Young World Changers Leading the Way. Adams formerly worked as Dean of Spiritual Life and Equity at the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, and now is the Executive Director of Community and Belonging at the St. Paul Schools in Maryland. That's kind of like the short version, and we have the long version, of course, on the website. And we were blessed to be able to have an excerpt from your book back in August. It's been a little while now, and so we're glad to have you here for the book club. I guess one way that we could start would be if you could just tell kind of like the backstory, the light version of how you came to write the book, and the title of Womanish. That was something that intrigued me a lot, how that originated.
Yeah, thanks. Um, is there background for me? Not sure. I heard an echo, sorry.
Okay.
I actually started with my first book, Parable of the Brown Girl, which was back in 2020 that first came out. And I was writing books about the lives of Black girls, adolescent Black girls, so 18 and under. Sometimes people say Black girls is like Black girl magic. It's about Black women too, right? But like I'm actually writing about the lives of adolescent Black girls. And so my first book, Parable, was just supposed to be a one and done. It was one of those books that I just didn't think that I didn't call myself an author. It was a book that I was writing. I wasn't like aspiring to be an author. And so I wanted to write about the girls that I had worked with, whether it was in ministry, whether it was in education. I was a pastoral counselor for a while. And so I would have these encounters, these spiritual encounters with these young women. And, not only would my life be changed, but it would reflect a lot of my own like experience and my own upbringing. And I would learn a lot about God and learn about the world. And so I felt like if I ever had an opportunity to center their stories, I would do so. And the first opportunity came about, which was Parable of the Brown Girl. The next book I wrote was called Unbossed, How Black Girls Are Leading the Way, about Gen Z Black girls who are leading different movements. And so it was sort of a continuation of that. Again, second book, right? Wasn't supposed to be like another one. But when it came time to write a third one, I wanted it to be almost like a trilogy. I wanted it to be the third version. The first book was more about just sort of like the cultural and experiences of Black girls. The second book was about leadership experiences of Black girls. This book was more about the faith journeys and the spiritual experiences of Black girls. And it started when I was actually doing a book talk for Parable of the Brown Girl. And one of the girls that was in one of my book talks asked me if, I ever consider writing like my own story. And I laughed. I was like, oh my God, I don't have anything like interesting happening in my life. And I said, who would read that? And she said, I would. And she was 15. And I was like, oh, she was like very serious, And so that was kind of when it started. And then it was another book talk where someone asked me, and I wrote this in the intro, what would a Black girl theology look like? And at the time, I'll explain the whole title. I was like, oh, we have womanist theology. But I did think a bit more about, okay, what would one that was solely centering the experiences and the lives of Black girls look like? So the thought process behind this book started years ago. I just didn't manifest into what it was until much later. When I was thinking about the spiritual lives and the spiritual journeys of Black girls and what they look like, I thought about my own life. So I wrote a lot about my own upbringing. You mentioned I went to Princeton. When I was at Princeton, a lot of particularly young white men, my young white male, colleagues and classmates had a lot of foreknowledge when they came to class. Like the first class, everybody knew who Karl Barth was. Everybody knew, who all the theologians were. And I felt like I had to play catch up. So, for a while, I almost convinced myself that I just learned theology in those 3 years that I was there, or that I was brand new to it. I didn't even consider my early experiences, whether it was in the church or even my experiences growing up with spiritual family members that were pouring into me. I never, ever considered that to be an adequate source of knowledge or theology. So it was only when I got to seminary. And so I thought about that. And I was like, wait a minute, I learned about prayer from my grandmother. Wait a minute, I learned about scripture from here. These are all things that I was exposed to as a young girl. But I was convinced that it wasn't theology. I was convinced that it wasn't substantive. So that's sort of like the quick version of what my thought process behind it. But when I thought about what would a Black girlhood theology look like, it was also the answer, the question of what would a Black girl theology be called. And so that's where womanish came from. So I always explain sort of the background when people are wondering what womanist theology is or what womanism is. I always start with talking about how, like, in the 60s, the civil rights movement addressed our Black identity, our ethnic identity, right? But a lot of times our womanhood was not considered, and misogyny was still very present. And then when the feminist movement arose, it addressed our womanhood, but the right to vote, women maybe had the right to vote, but Black women did not have the right to vote. So it didn't necessarily address our Black identity either. So there's an intersection of our identities that has never quite been addressed. And because of that, Black feminism and then subsequently womanism arose. Womanism comes from author Alice Walker, who in her book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens coined the term womanism. And she started with a definition of it coming from this term womanish, which is an old term. It's not necessarily used nowadays, but it was an old term from generations previous, where, elders, mothers, grandmothers would say to their daughters, you're acting womanish, you're acting grown, if you're trying to get involved into adult conversations or adult doings. So it was like, okay, you're acting womanish. So that's sort of where womanist came from. That's the foundations of womanist and womanism. And womanist theology subsequently addresses the spiritual and religious experiences of Black women and as being adequate sources of knowledge and getting us closer to God, right? And so womanism and womanist theology both do address Black girlhood within it. And so I always want to be clear about that it doesn't completely exclude altogether. It just, there is a heavy focus and emphasis on Black women in adulthood. So I felt like I just sort of borrowed the term from Alice Walker, and I borrowed the term womanish, and sort of that's where womanish theology came from.
Okay, good. Um, One of the things that I wanted to mention is I love how you weave your faith and your church related experiences and just recount so many of those experiences throughout the book, and then alongside stories from girls and women that you've interviewed and spoken to. And I was hoping that maybe you could expound some on how your early faith foundation helped you to your journey towards teaching and the development of faith for Black girls.
Yeah, so and I mentioned this in the book, not every Black woman or Black girl has grown up with a spiritual experience, but there are many of us, because I don't want to exclude, there are many of us, though, that have had very similar experiences. So a lot of the women that I interviewed were like, really, that your grandmother prayed at 12 noon too, which happens a lot in the Black community. And so I grew up in one of those sort of environments of having a grandmother, a great aunt as well, my grandmother's sister, and a great grandmother who passed along the faith. And passing on these things were always really important, particularly in the Black community too. And it goes back to the time of enslavement, of, not being able to read and not really having access to our history. And so oral history was so important, and passing on oral traditions, passing on, stories of our past, were really important to do for the next generation. So I feel like I was sort of a part of that too, with my great grandmother, my grandmother. And so it was really important when I spent time with them for them to pass it along. They saw it as it was their responsibility. It literally was just, that's what we did. And so that's really sort of how I grew up, even before I stepped foot in a church, even though I was christened in a church, but even outside of Sunday mornings, or even outside of the church walls, there was a spiritual upbringing that was necessary, and it was a part of our household. And so things like, in which, I'm sure we'll get into, I said prayer or scripture, and when I say scripture, like, I write in the book about how we had these little, like, it was called Our Daily Bread, and it would be on the table, before we like had a meal. And Our Daily Bread had like Proverbs and Psalms, like little scriptures in them. And our grandmother, myself and my cousins would sit around the table, and before we ate a meal, she would have us pick one of those out and read the scripture. Didn't matter if we could read well or not, And so our, it was like, that was when I was exposed to scripture first. I didn't know anything about anything, right? Or even I talk about in the book about communion in the Baptist church. You can't do communion unless you were baptized. And so, I would be sitting in church, and I wouldn't understand anything that the pastor was saying, nothing. But when the communion plate came around, everybody took one. I didn't understand why I couldn't take one, and my grandmother would say, no, 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 not yet. You have to be baptized. And I'm like, well, what do I have to do to be baptized? Like, so these were things that we talked, that I was, were taught to me, and were just sort of a part of our daily, um, growing up, just even as a young person. And so there's so many stories like that. And then eventually, growing up in a church that had a strong emphasis on the spiritual development of young people was another part. Yeah, I would say the second part, the part B to my spiritual growth or introductions. And so, I just wasn't able to truly articulate those things, I would say, until later, you know. So like when I say things like, wow, prayer, like I didn't just know the Lord's Prayer, I was taught the Lord's Prayer. You know what I mean? Like I was taught it in school. In Vacation Bible School, I was taught it in church, but I was also taught it from my parents. Saying grace, things like saying grace, like even now, people that, don't go to church or maybe don't consider themselves spiritual people, they understand the importance of saying grace. So, it's Black girlhood, yes. And what I'm hoping in this book too is that it brings up, like, my experiences in my Black girlhood, brings up other experiences that other people have had in their adolescence, no matter what their background or their ethnicity is. You know what I'm saying? I think many of us have stories or have moments that we can remember and say, wait a minute, that was theology too.
Right. Sorry, I had muted myself for a
Oh, it's
second.
okay.
Um, that's all really good, very helpful. I wanted to ask you too about the way that you structured the book. When I was reading, I thought this is just great. It's actually very structured. It has a section for scripture, salvation, the Imago Dei, theodicy, prayer, hospitality, service, and I was hoping that we could read something from each chapter, but I don't think we'll have time. But in the scripture chapter, there was a section called "Because the Bible Tells Me So," that talks about the family Bibles. I just really loved that section, and I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit to that, and the mothers and the grandmothers and the passing the torch.
So I really start with the first part of what you said about like how I structured the book.
Yes.
And I did it on purpose because I remember reading the systematic theology books in seminary and how they were structured and how you were able to open it, and you were able to open to predestination, or whatever the theological topic might be. So very similarly, I wanted it to be, I wanted to open up womanish theology and say, if I was opening up womanish theology and it was a systematic theology book, what would the title of the chapters be called? I don't want it to be any different than what Paul Tillich's, any of these other books that really, the classical books that go into systematic theology. I didn't want it to be any different. So that was why I structured it that way. But going back to because the Bible tells me so, it's very similar to what I had just said about just, it's interesting because had I not written this book, I would not have, I don't know if I want to say pieced together. There's an appreciation I think that I have for my upbringing that I didn't have before, because I was able to intentionally reflect and go back and think. And I don't know if I would have had the space to do that. And I would love to provide that space for other people to do that, even if it's like a retreat space or something like that, because I think if we had that intentional time, a lot of us, we'd be able to go back and really, like, I don't know, learn why we are who we are today, or,
Right.
just things that we took for granted or forgot. A lot of us have selective memories or just things very vague, and it's really hard to write books like that are memoirish, because you really do have to sit and do that intentional just reimagining and all of that, and really just going back, like just really in like internalizing, like going within. So for those types of sections and chapters where I'm writing about the family Bible, I I forgot that. Like I knew it, but I forgot that that was like a thing. And then when I sat and thought about, like, oh, I remember walking into my grandmother's home and the big white Bible in the middle of what, was likely kind of altar-ish, right? The table, you kind of didn't touch it. And it had these gold print, it was King James version. and and it was like gold, like, the pages were kind of gold on the edges, and it was saying something, right? It was saying that this is a household of faith. And it was also like we didn't just touch it. We you can look in it, but we weren't just like, throwing it around. And then there were the Bibles, like the Bible she has, or she had, that was passed down. My mom still has today from my great grandmother, likely even before then, the Warren Bible, with the Warren pages, with the notes in the margins, and just like the red, underline and things like that, and had my great grandmother's name in the beginning of the Bible. It says this belongs to, and the date. And then there were some Bibles. I didn't write this, but I don't know if any of you remember, there were some Bibles that had like family genealogy in it, and which is really interesting. From what I remember, it would have like family tree like in the beginning of it. So you know whether or not I really truly understood, um I don't believe so, but I think I was just the exposure to it planted a seed. And I can say that I have witnessed it grow, but the seed began there. It didn't begin years later when I took, intro to New Testament. You know what I mean? It
Yeah.
started with my grandmother.
Right. It's beautiful. Um, there was something that you introduced in the book that when I read it, it was kind of unexpected, but it was wonderful. The Imago Dei, the concept of the Imago Dei, and how how you bring that to the girls. I wonder if you could share some about that and all the goodness that that brings into their lives.
I wrote a bit about Imago Dei in Parable of the Brown Girl too. I think we had emailed about that. And this idea that we were created in the image of God. And a lot of what I write about is how, if we were created in the image of God, if you sit and think about how many images there are
Yes.
on this earth, when you sit and think about how everybody does not have the same fingerprint patterns, and it's overwhelming and if we were all made in the image of God, then it is overwhelming at how much we have to learn about God from each other if we were truly all created in the image of God. And so, that's my DEI, that's my diversity, sort of platform is, that we have something to learn about God from every single person. And particularly those on the margins, particularly those that are overlooked. And so I make the argument that Black girls were created in the image of God. It's like saying Black Lives Matter. And Black girls were created in the image of God. And so I've been writing about that in all of my books. And also just sort of sharing that too with the girls more practically. Like, did you know you were created in the image of God? Um, and just how the church, I would say, or the spiritual community can really, how do we practice that around these different groups? And I say that because we've said, image of God, we say it, you create an image of God, but I don't know how much we're demonstrating it.
Right.
And I don't think that Black girls, the ones that the community that I feel like I'm called to of Black girls, are really getting that. They're hearing more messages about how, their skin is too dark or too this, their hair is too this, they are too loud. Every single stereotype under the sun and myth is what it is that they have to counter on a daily basis that society says about them. And then we come along and say, do you know that you create an image of God? And they're supposed to get that when the majority of the messages that they're getting are antithetical to that. And so I write about that again, like I said, consistently in all the books. And I've asked the girls, do you know that you were created? And they say, oh yeah, but then they'll share their experiences where the circumstance or the experience, the message sent to them was that they weren't created in the image of God. I talk about myself, of course, in all the chapters, but in that chapter, and how, I just struggle with my identity, in my upbringing in schools, in church, what image am I created in? And I think the physical aesthetic is very much a part of that as well. And so Black girls sort of growing up, having to counter these messages, yet also being on these spiritual journeys as well. How it's just this fine line, this dance that they have to sort of do back and forth of telling themselves or reminding themselves that they are, but constantly being reminded outside that they aren't.
There was something in the theodicy chapter. I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about that, about your experience with morale. Um, I mean, towards the end of the chapter, you had talked about the choice of gratitude in response to evil and suffering. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess mostly addressing that and the resilience, the choice of response and the resilience. It's just something that I thought was so beautiful. Um, so as much as you might want to share with us about that.
So I wrote a chapter, Womanish Theology, and theodicy is a term that says, that asks the question, if God is a good God, then why is there evil and suffering? And we all grapple with that question. But specifically, I was writing about how Black girls grapple with it. And I started talking about myself and how I first grappled with it when my friend Norel was killed when I was 15. She was 16. And her father, she was murdered by her father. And then it was a domestic violence incident of herself. And then her mom was killed. And then it was a murder suicide. So it was my first time being, you know, being exposed to that level of violence and having to ask that question because I had known things happen. I experienced some death, but nothing like that. Which I'm glad I wrote about it because, and that's my first time experiencing something like that. But I think about this generation and just how much it's all around them that they have to experience. And when I spoke to Black girls and I speak to young people in general, I work with young people, and I always say, how is it growing up in an active shooter generation, right? Like I did not have active shooter drills. We had fire drills. And I was a senior in high school when Columbine happened, and that was, my first time ever, or really experiencing something like that. So it wasn't just a part of the life routine. And so I think about these girls now and everything else that's happening. They're so connected to the world. Like we just had, the newspapers and the news, but they know what's happening in Palestine. They know what's happening, in our nation. And so it's all around them. And then they have their own personal situations and lives that they have to deal with. So I was curious, what does theodicy, I wrote about what does theodicy mean for me, or what did it mean for me as a 15-year-old? But I'm curious what it means for 15-year-olds today growing up in the society that we do grow up in. And, just even the last few weeks and, just some of the young people that I've had conversation with that or wondering the direction of our nation. They're wondering, why this or what's the, and I'm watching them grapple and ask questions, and then also have to sort of continue to move forward. That's what that resilience is. That's what I want to point out. It's like I talked to this one 16-year-old a few weeks ago, and we were just talking about life and things happening in the world or whatever. And she was saying how she really doesn't understand. And she was, I pray and ask God, whatever. And then she sort of concluded with like, I don't know if she said God is in control or I just gotta trust God. And then she moved on talking about, prom or something. Like she said, it was just so interesting seeing how they have to still be young people, but still be in this. They can't like escape it in ways that I think I was able to escape. That's for the adults. That's what my generation at least was able to do. Um, we weren't like surrounded by it all the time. And even if we were shielded from it, a lot of us.
Mhm.
Um, and so, to watch the young people now, you know, particularly these young girls, I didn't see them blaming God, you know, which is something I think I would have done in my generation, right? Because I come from the personal relationship with Jesus generation of like, you're supposed to answer my prayers, and so I think this generation of young people seems very communal. They seem very like, it's our responsibility to pick up the pieces. It's our responsibility to solve this, which is why I wrote Unbossed. But how they grapple with suffering and how they grapple with evil, they don't ignore it. They face it head on, but they still find joy. They're still resilient and they still like live their lives. Like they're still able to be 16. That's like amazing to me. And when I interviewed I interviewed one young woman from the Parkland school. There was a school shooting back in 2013, I think it was, and she wound up being in March for Our Lives as a speaker. And to hear, I watched her, and she would be on this tour, March for Our Lives. They had like this tour like that summer or whatever. She was traveling all over the country speaking, you know, um, against or speaking against the things that had happened, and she um was sort of an advocate for nonviolence, but she would be like exhausted and then somehow like still be on social media posting with her friends, still be able to go back and take her test. Like she was still a kid. And that was just fascinating to me. And that's what I see with this generation a lot.
Yeah, that is amazing. That ability to compartmentalize and keep going. I can't even do that at this point in time.
Mhm.
That in the chapter on prayer, that's another chapter I loved so much. I had so much identity with, and I was just wanting to ask you to share some on that prayer chapter. I had a praying grandmother and a praying mama. I'm quoting a couple of things out of the book. The Black church has a rich history and a unique approach to prayer that reflect our cultural and spiritual heritage, and it truly is beautiful. And I just wanted you to share a little bit about that chapter.
You know, I think it Martin Luther King to talk a lot about the personal God and um, how that God is deeply, and that's going back to Advent, right? Like Emmanuel, God with us, that God is like entering into our suffering. And uh, a lot of his message was about God caring about, like God cares. God sees your tears. God hears your prayer. God cares. And that's the God we serve. God, and that is very personal. And that is very much passed on again, and when my ancestors didn't have access to actual Bibles or reading or anything, they're not only passing on oral traditions, but part of the traditions was prayer, right? Was reaching out to this God that you absolutely have to care about our plight and our existence and what we're going through. And we're going to lean on the God of Moses. We're going to lean on the God, and I believe that to have been passed down. And my mom, I interviewed my mom about, her prayer experiences growing up. And I write about how my great grandmother, used to have them praying like 12 noon. I think it was like 6 p.m. I don't know if it was 2 or 3 times a day, but 12 noon was like the big one. 6 a.m., 12 noon, and 6 p.m., I think. And how it didn't matter where they were at 12 noon, she would scream, "It's prayer time." And they would have to run in, and pray. And it's interesting because I interviewed another woman who didn't, who I, she hadn't, I hadn't written the book. I was just interviewing people for the book. And she said, 12 noon, my grandmother would be like, "It's prayer time." And I'm like literally listening to her like wanting to tell her, "Oh my gosh, we have these similar stories." Like, and she wasn't the only one that said something similar like that. And so that's what our family hung on to. And it wasn't about ritual, I think ritual is important, but how sacred and how you stop everything and you go before God. Doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter what you're doing. This is most important. And so those would be traditions. We didn't necessarily have the 3 times a day, prayer time with my immediate family, but we definitely had, when we would gather for holidays, Christmas or whatever, like before we would get on the road, you're not getting on the road before you pray. You're not praying, you're not just getting on the road. And around Thanksgiving coming up, we had a prayer. Like it wasn't just we just not diving in to eat. It's, everybody saying what they're grateful for. And my great aunt was going in prayer. My uncle was praying, you know. Um, so it was just a part of our lifestyle. And I'm grateful because even the times that I have felt um far from the church, I had the prayer part, right? If so, even if I felt far from the institution or what was going on, at the end of the day, I have prayer as my individual relationship with God, but that communal prayer is something that's very important.
That's great. There was one section, I think it was in that chapter, it was you were talking about the chair and the prayer and just going on and on. And once you start thanking God, it's like there's another thing to thank Him for, and another thing. And I love that. You want to share a little bit about that?
I talked about in the beginning of the chapter about prayer being passed down from my family. And then I talked about that second part, my spiritual journey, in the church that I grew up in, and just as a teenager, and some of the things that we were being taught. And I just never, I knew prayer was important, but I wasn't like a prayer. Like I thought there was like a rhythm or a pattern, or there was like a way to pray. I just really didn't know. And everybody else that prayed around me, I always felt like they were like experts in prayer. And so my youth pastor, Mike Penix, had said once to us, all you have to do, get a chair and put it up, in wherever you are, turn it around, an empty chair, and just talk to the chair like you're talking to God. Just talk to the chair. And I thought it was silly at first, but the first time I did, I really needed it. And I was like, you know what? Turn the chair, turn the chair. And I just was like, hey, God, and just started talking. And I think that really opened a door for me as far as like prayer being my constant conversation with God, as opposed to a way. When you're younger and you're taught this is the Lord's Prayer, this is how you say grace, this is how, or you hear other people praying and with their rhythms and how they pray, you think, okay, that's how it's done. But I realized that there is no how it's done in that moment. And so I think it opened up a door for me, not just to, talk to God with an empty chair, which I did all through college. Well, my roommate wasn't in the room at least. And, there was journaling. I would get a composition notebook and write my prayers in there. And, I just realized that there's so much more than their liturgical prayer. They're written prayers. There are so many different forms of prayer, and there's no right way. And I think that moment of like talk to the chair was the open door for me there.
Cool. Thank you. Um, in the chapter on hospitality, there was this cute story I just loved so much about Jason, and I don't know if you would like to share that little story kind of briefly and talk about how that ties into hospitality and beginning the Black Girls Gathering.
So I had to go way back in my memory for this one when I wrote it, but I was thinking about my early introductions to hospitality. And again, a lot of it came from my family and how we just had a revolving door. If somebody needed a home, you give them a home. Somebody needed a place to stay, um, and I saw that rubbed off on me. And so I write the story about how I was born in Brooklyn and lived in Brooklyn the first few years of my life. And so we were in Brooklyn, me and my dad, we were at this McDonald's on Flatbush Ave. And we left the McDonald's and there was this brown bear that was like on the ground. And it was a little teddy bear. And we walked away. And then I pulled my dad back. We got to go back. That bear cannot be alone. Somebody abandoned the bear. And the bear was like, had a little stuffing coming out of it, and the eye was scratched up and, didn't have anything on it. It was kind of like, it was kind of like flimsy. And my dad was like, all right, don't touch the bear. We got to wash the bear before you even, like, he grabbed it. And so my dad put the bear in the washing machine. And I remember sitting there at the house thinking, okay, like when the bear was drying, what am I going to name the bear? I don't know how I got Jason, but I named the bear Jason. And then we sewed the bear's arm and put like a little, like, I found one of my toys had this like little pajama top and put it over them. And so Jason the bear, I still have today. I told Jason, I will never leave you. I will never abandon you again. And here we are, many, 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 many years later, decades later, I still have Jason the bear. And but I use that as an example of like, you know, of the hospital, starting off the hospitality chapter and saying how it was just sort of innate within me. It was passed down, but it was sort of innate. Um, not just bears, but dogs and like human beings, and how hospitality was just very much a part of my family and my upbringing and who we were. And I interviewed some black girls, like this particular generation, and just not just interviewed, but also the ones that I've worked with, and watching how hospitable they are. And just watching Black girls and even Black women over the last few weeks, everybody's just binding together. This is what we do, we look out for one another. And a lot of times when you're if you're a minority, or you're part of a smaller community, you're all you have. But it's not just us, but it's also, we understand what it's like, right, to be marginalized, to be left out, to be overlooked. We don't want other people to feel that way either. So there is this sense of this, like, bring you in if you're in need. And that's the hospitality of Jesus. That's the, you offered me a home. I needed a home, offered me a home, Um, and so that's basically what that chapter is about. I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry. From the chapter on service, thank you for sharing that too. I loved that story. From the chapter on service, I was wondering if maybe you could share some about your family background, and being the deacon's home, and the benevolence, and how that led to the life of, you used the phrase faith in action, and I really loved that, um, seeking to create positive environments.
So churches, the church that I grew up at, motto was faith in action. And our church was very active in the community. My pastor was Secretary of State of New Jersey for a few years. So he was very back and forth. Um, we were not just a Sunday morning church. And so service was quite literally like what we were known for. My parents were deacon and deaconesses in that church. And so they were very much a part of that leadership structure. I talk about my dad and how he was over the benevolence ministry for 30 years. And that was a ministry that, there was always a collection that was taken up, or any extra monies that the church had, that would go into a fund, a benevolence fund, for people that were in need. And people would, put in applications, or come, my light bill is off, or, my mortgage isn't paid, or I can't pay for this funeral. They really were in a bind. And my dad was responsible for, you know, working with those families. And there would be times where he would take checks, they weren't just coming to the church. They would cut a check, and he would go to the leasing office, or he would go to the homes, or if there was like a flood, in an apartment complex, or if there was some sort of weather related, natural disaster nearby, or whatever it might be. My dad was very much on top of that. Um, and I grew up watching that. Same thing with my mom. She was an educator, and I write about, how she, there was a student who came to school who, had some hygiene issues, and she realized that, because of her financial situation, and she was sort of raising herself, she wasn't able to wash her clothes. So my mom would have her come early and bring her clothes. And my mom would wash them in the athletics room washer, and then have them washed and dried and folded and have them for her before the end of the day. And no one would know, so that no one would know. So those were things that I was exposed to growing up, and because of that, I think the service part was naturally within me. There was a time where I remember in high school, our teachers were asking us what we wanted to be when we grew up, and I didn't know, but I always said, I just want to serve because that's what you do, you know. It's similar. I talk about how hospitality and service, there's a lot of overlap, but you know, that is the hands and feet of Jesus, you know. And I was always taught that the pulpit was not the central, you know, it was the culminating word on Sunday morning, but it wasn't who we were. And it's interesting because, you know, I see a lot of churches, you know, over time have gotten to that, you know, everything is about this service and this, I mean, this worship service, which is all well and good. And that's sort of it. But that was never the case for us growing up. I was happy about our worship service. I thought it was cool, but no, that wasn't who we were. And so because of that, that rubbed off on me later. So when I got to college, you know, I was not near my home. I went to college in Temple University in Philadelphia, and that was like an hour and some change from my parents' house and my childhood church. I wasn't going back often, but I kept, you know, I was looking. That's what you're supposed to look to serve. So I wasn't just going to class or going to church. I remember I would teach GED classes at AmeriCorps for students that couldn't finish school and didn't finish school on time. I remember I taught English as a second language, even though I don't know any other languages, but I taught English as a second language to two elder Russian women. I remember once, and I was teaching through like visual aids, you know. Um, I would put on like play productions with my friends. We would put on all out play productions because I felt like, you know, people need like people that couldn't afford it and they would be free, couldn't afford to go out to the theater. We wanted to give them a night where they too, you know, people in North Philly too could go, you know, catch a show and it not cost them an arm and a leg. But it was like I wasn't doing that for glorification or anything like that. I was doing that because that's how I was programmed.
It's all beautiful. Um, we're going to be closing out in just a little bit. I think Shane's going to come back in to do that, but I was just going to ask you just before he does that, is there anything else that you would like to say to share with everybody about this book, how people can find you? One last wise thought.
Um, I would say that I want to, I want womanish theology to not be like I just want it to be one of a canon, right? Like it's not supposed to be, you know, I started this and I named this thing, this theology. It's not supposed to be that. And it's also not supposed to be, it's not supposed to end there. Like I want to read books about Asian American, you know, adolescent spiritual story. You know what I mean? Like I want to read those. I think again goes back to Imago Dei. There's so much that we have to learn from these experiences that we would have never learned about God in any other way had we not had these opportunities. And so I just hope womanish theology opens that door.
It's great. Thank you.
I didn't want to take up too much of the screen, so I just put my little camera off. But I've been over here taking notes, Khristi. Am I allowed to ask one question,
Yeah,
Susan?
please.
I just, you know, it feels like a missed opportunity to not ask you a little bit about the current moment. You know, I mean, your book kind of paves the way for all of that, but obviously, you know, there's a piece of the reckoning that we're in right now in our country where once again 81 of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump, and Black women have been the rebuke of that, really, the conscience of our country, deeply rooted in the faith that you so eloquently talk about, but that, is some 90% or something that stood against him. And it's not just the person, right? It's all these principalities and powers and the stuff that holds people down, and power and white supremacy. So I didn't know if you have, I guess the question will be kind of what womanish theology has to offer all of us at this current moment.
Where's this book behind me that I was looking at earlier? Sorry. I just happened, so it's a book by Robert Michael Franklin.
Mm.
It's called Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, Imagination. And I happened to see it. I don't know why my eyes just looked at it today, and I was like, And I just sort of like went past it and was like, is this book relevant anymore?
Mm.
And the woman asked me the other day, I did a talk about womanish theology, and she said, Martin Luther King once said, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. Do you feel that way?
Mm.
I said, well, if he said the arc of the moral universe, the question is, are we living in a moral universe? And what do we do with that right now? And so I've been grappling with that, with the two realities, the kingdom of God reality and then the earth reality, right? And which reality we want to exist under. And I think the kingdom of God reality exists under this, right? And I think the reality of what we're seeing, not just with this election in general, is antithetical to that. And it's which one are we going to submit to, and which are we going to live under? And we got to make a choice, like choose this day who you will serve, right? God or man. And I feel like, not to bring everything back to the book, right? I think it does touch on that, but it's a reminder of this moral leadership, of this kingdom of God, of this morality, of this choice that we have. And God has given us a choice. And what do we want to exist under? And I see some people, it's like the great falling away, that are just sort of giving in because it might be easier. And it's a sacrifice to be a person of integrity in the society that we live in now. That's a sacrifice, and it's not going to come easy. And I think that we thought, like we thought we were heading, whether it's back or we were already there, but I think that's a tough pill to swallow. We're not there. We're not in a moral universe. So the arc of the moral universe might bend toward justice, not here, so what do we do with that? I think the girls that I work with offer, or that I've interviewed or that I write about, offer pockets of hope, because even in societies, even in the Old Testament, we see that there may have been chaos and corruption all around, but there were these pockets, or when Jesus came, there arose, there arose a king, there arose this, and I think we need to lean on that. I'm not saying we give up on this, but I have to be reminded that this is the kingdom that I want to live under and that I want to submit to, even if the one around me does not.
Well, you're a gift. I hope we keep seeing more of you and hearing more of you around our little RLC movement. But tell people also how they can, one more time, how they can kind of follow your socials and see where you're speaking and, get more of your wisdom.
Well, I'm on Instagram, so definitely you can follow me on Instagram at Khristi Adams. I am no longer on X because I had to make a decision. So I'm not on X, but I am on Threads. But I also, I'm on ChristiLaurenAdams.com is my website, and feel free to Google me. Again, I'm not like so everything isn't social media, and that's something that we're having to find ways of staying connected to people apart from that. But right now, and then you can get the books all on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or the Brazos Press website for Womanish.
Yeah. Awesome, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. Get the whole trilogy, but definitely check this one out, Womanish Theology. Susan, thanks for leading us tonight. So we'll see y'all soon. Sunday, it's this Sunday that we'll have morning prayer, December 1st, with our friends in Palestine. And join us next month for book club and anytime in between. Love